Hello and welcome back to SD Myths. The wait is finally over, and I am back to see just how far I can get in this crazy challenge, which is, of course, to beat Cuphead without shooting. We last left off after completing Inkwell Isle 1, facing some pretty considerable opponents along the way, and you can probably tell by the space between uploads that this isle wasn't any more of a walk in the park. But we'll get to that green, scaly bridge when we have to cross it. Well, without further introduction, let's see how this second isle fared for me. We start off with the easiest of the 5 bosses, Miss Candy herself. As you may know, she's a very RNG-based boss with her 5 minions coming out at random during the 3 different phases. I'll eventually talk about how to handle each of the 5 separately, but first let's go over some overall tips. First of all, you were able to wetstone a lot of stuff in this fight, such as the green jelly beans, which is very helpful to know when you have to deal with everything else on the screen. Also, during the 3rd phase of the fight, you were able to clear away all the cotton candy snipe shots with a single super shot. Now with that out of the way, let's first talk about the Jawbreaker. The Jawbreaker is by far the easiest of the 5 in the cast to handle. This is due to its inability to do damage from a distance, and due to the fact that you have Whetstone, which can easily nullify this. This makes it very easy to kite the Jawbreaker, and then Whetstone when we have the opportunity to hit. Since this is the easiest of the 5, you usually want to see this one in the 3rd phase. Fighting the Cupcake is also pretty straightforward. There's a guaranteed way to do damage and avoid getting hit by whetstoning him as soon as he lands and then dashing away, as long as you don't dash into the corners because you might not get far enough away to avoid the splats. You are able to short hop in order to whetstone the Cupcake while he is under the moving platform, which can be useful for getting more hits in. Next on the list is the Gumball guy. From experience, it seems like it's much easier to hit him from the right side, which is likely due to his gumballs going left whenever he does his attack. He can be annoying on the 2nd and 3rd phase due to the limited space and the fact that you have to anticipate the jelly beans and or the sniper shots. You're usually most safe to whetstone him when he's facing towards you, so take that into consideration. Now coming towards the more annoying of the 5, the candy corn is just a nightmare to face. It is very beneficial to reset if you get him in the 1st phase because he takes forever to kill. It is very hard to hit him when he's on the top of the screen, so you end up having to wait for him to land, and since his movement is unpredictable, it's very risky to go for whetstone reads. You are kind of forced to play aggressively if you want to kill him, which is asking for you to get hit, especially the multiple mini-cords that appear from behind his path. It's actually a little bit easier during the later phases because you usually have more super shots to handle him, but nonetheless I usually just cry when I see him come out. But even though the candy corn is bad, he is not pale in comparison to the waffle. The waffle just sucks. His movement is somehow more unpredictable than the candy corn, and his attack can be very hard to avoid based on his positioning. Trying to whetstone him is a pain because he has iframes when he charges up his attack. This is another boss I would prefer in later phases, mainly phase 2, so you don't have to deal with sniper shots while also having to dodge this monster. But he is nonetheless doable. If you're able to get consistent fighting these 5, you will eventually get to the final phase of the fight, where Miss Candy orders her castle to sprout legs and shoot peppermints at you. The moving castle phase is pretty simple, but it is long, so patience is a virtue here. You're surprisingly able to safely whetstone her by hitting her from below. Another good tactic is dash from the platform and then immediately whetstone her. Most of your time should be spent creating openings while avoiding the head, which is usually easy to avoid if you dash a lot. You also want to pay close attention to the castle to make sure you don't get hit by any peppermints. You are able to parry them if push comes to shove. Overall, this phase is relatively simple, and if you follow these tenets, you will be able to get your first soul contract of the 2nd island. After fighting Miss Candy, you were then able to do both run and guns to get more coins. These levels aren't necessarily interesting because you can just follow the pacifist routes for both without much issue, so I'm not going to comment on them much. The only real difference is that you have to grab the coins. After you're done with those, it's time for another nice trip to the shop, where you can now start to buy some new weapons for different types of supers. I decided to buy Spread Shot, Roundabout, and Charge Shot because I thought those would be the most useful for other bosses, but for this isle, all I needed was the Spread Shot to be effective. And actually, the Spread Shot immediately comes into use as we fight the clown. The key part to handling the 1st phase is managing the ducks. You are able to whetstone the yellow ducks, so make sure to keep them clear so you're able to cross the screen as Mr. Clown Guy does. Attempting to whetstone the dude while he's doing his jig can be risky due to his randomness. It is much easier to whetstone him as he is transitioning. Phase 2 of this fight has one of the rare moments where the hurt box of the boss does not overlap with any sort of hitbox, making it very easy to whetstone. Using the Spread Shot super here is optimal because you're able to hit him fully while you're in the center of his face. This can usually be done after you whetstone him from below. You are also able to whetstone the normal dogs, so make sure to keep those under check while also keeping track of the train that periodically appears from the side. Phase 3 is one of those rare moments when the hitbox of the boss does not overlap with the hurt box, that being the face of the horse, meaning it's actually impossible to get in whetstones during this phase. Thank goodness there's a way to farm cards in this phase or else it'd be impossible, but that does not make it any less annoying in the slightest. This basically makes this phase a boring waiting game of farming for parries. It is usually a good idea to farm some cards from earlier phases just to speed this one up, especially if you've gotten the hang of the earlier ones. When you get here, it's just a game of waiting and praying while positioning yourself in the right place when the green horse finally shoots out that one pink horseshoe, but eventually you'll be able to get through. The final phase can be a little awkward, especially considering you will have used all your cards on the last phase. You want to get as many whetstones on the central hurt box as you can, while eventually avoiding the baseballs that the seals throw. I would not advise clearing all of them out as they are able to create a hitbox in their head region, which would cause you to take damage. Getting 1 or 2 is fine, but you usually will have to just avoid the rest. Pairing the central hurt box is a good way to get height to avoid these baseballs. And you just have to do that on repeat for a couple times, just going ham on this dude until he dies, or whatever. And with that, you'll have your second soul contract for this island. After that, it's time for a double feature of plane fights. First starting with the genie guy. For this island, I have decided not to use the coffee because it felt kinda cheap, especially during the Hildeberg fight. But that won't matter for this one because you do need the whetstone anyway. Something unique about plain whetstoning is the need to immediately back up after getting a hit in, because you don't keep your iframes for very long. Unless you have perfect spacing, you may leave yourself open to a stray collision, and trust me, that happened a lot. At the beginning of the fight, the genie can start with 3 different attacks that come from his chest of mystery. I advise to reset if you don't get swords. Like, you can technically succeed with the cats, but the jewels are really annoying, and the cats aren't that great either. The swords are just much easier than the rest of them. So once you reset for swords and dodge the face attack at the beginning, you want to start farming cards first from the pink swords before advancing to the next phase. You're usually able to anticipate where the swords are going, so it's all about finding your openings and getting your whetstones in after you've farmed enough cards. Phase 2 is the reason why whetstoning is required. You are able to spend your cards here, but that is mainly a waste, as you are able to whetstone the rotating faces to get through. Since you have to whetstone a face twice to break it, you should first whetstone it and then back up, and then immediately whetstone it as it connects with you not moving forward at all. This is usually enough, combined with a little bit of maneuvering around the swirly spikes, to get you through this phase with relative ease. Immediately after this is a lesson in aggressive play with the coffin guy. You will have 5 cards at this point, so you should activate your atomic bomb immediately, and then go to town whetstoning the red face coming out of the coffin. The mummy ghosts that go across the screen appear basically at random, in random locations, so you want to be fast on your toes and get the damage in as fast as possible, so you don't risk taking as much damage. You're usually able to get 2 hits in before he sends his eyes at you, and then you should back up and go past them in small form to get back to whetstoning. I would advise being in the shrunken form as much as possible during this phase for extra maneuverability to avoid the ghosts. It does take a lot of whetstoning, but you do eventually get to the next phase, the puppet, which is definitely the patience phase of this boss fight. Since he puts up a barrier when he shoots its shots, you will have to wait around a lot during this phase. Landing whetstones can be tricky during the in-between phases due to his movement from side to side, which can catch you off guard. This means most of your damage will be achieved by farming parries and getting bombs in. The final phase definitely marks the most stressful point of this fight. You likely won't have many cards at the point, so it's all up to the whetstones. The real difficulty here comes from multitasking, watching out for the pyramids and the head beam. Just make sure to get your hits in on the cooldown and be where the pyramid won't be when it fires, not when it charges up. And so careful attention to whetstones, you should be able to get your 3rd soul contract of the island. Once the genie goes down, it is now bird o'clock. Mr. Warbles has a pretty annoying first phase. His constant up and down movement makes it difficult to attack from above and below, and his constant egg spewing displays horizontal attacks. His timing can be pretty sporadic, so you'll have to spend some time getting a feel for when to capitalize on his openings. Eventually his bird friends will come in, and you definitely want to grab parries from them. Soon after you get to the Toho phase of the fight, where you just have to wait around for the bird to get tired. It's very easy to whetstone him during the openings, but you also should try to drop a bomb or 2 if possible. It is also advised to keep 5 cards during the transition because it is much more useful for phase 3. Dealing with the bird's big brain sidekick isn't the most enjoyable of endeavors. You really want to abuse the iframes granted by the bomb in this phase to get hits in, and then be able to get away from the rotating eggs of doom. Staying in shrunken form will definitely save your life here. You are able to get cards easily in this phase, so bombing is the best option for damage, and since the phase is surprisingly consistent in its predictability, it's not so bad once you're able to get the pattern down. For the final phase, you're back to farming parry, similar to another plane boss that we fought in the first island. Big Bird has a long body, so the rockets have a lot of time to chew through, so it's not really worth whetstoning him at all. You should hold off your shots when the heart is out, because the main body loses her box during this attack. You will have to make the trek through no man's land multiple times to avoid getting crushed by the side of the screen, but you should generally stay in the bottom left and bottom right corners to avoid as much of the attacks as possible. Dealing with the garbage usually isn't a problem because it generally comes out when you're on the left side of the screen most often. The most dangerous projectiles on the screen are actually the pills, due to how fast they can come out and how they home in on you. But honestly, it's not that bad of a final phase. So, after dealing with all of those relatively easy bosses, it's finally time to face what caused this video to take so long: Mr. Dragon. To put it in perspective, I look back on those golden days back in video 1 and consider myself naive for even complaining about the frogs. It took actual months of attempting this boss, on and off, to finally beat him. I spent multiple weeks away from the game due to how frustrating and demanding this stuttering green turd is. There are actually many different moments over the course of these months where I felt like the run just wasn't worth completing, just due to how hard this boss can be. And I will demonstrate this to you in very clear detail, starting with Phase 1. Phase 1 actually consists of 3 pseudo-phases that progressively get more hectic the more damage you do. Of these pseudo-phases, the first consists of firing 2 to 3 ring lasers with 3 rings in each. The second is spewing fireballs that alternate between going up first and down first, and the third is alternating between upgraded versions of both the ring lasers and the fireballs, with a cute tail that makes an annoying cameo. In a normal run, you would be able to go through this boss without even knowing it had certain damage thresholds before it varies its attacks. The Whetstone is so weak when it comes to DPS that he cycles through these pseudo-phases multiple times, so it's best to just consider them as their own phases. Mr. Dragon is a very vertical hurt box, so you usually have to attack it from the upper right corner to get damage in. This can be very inconsistent due to the bane of my existence that is RNG. The cloud patterns are very unpredictable, which makes it hard to get hits in sometimes and dodge certain attacks. For Pseudo Phase 1, you want to get full cards and just start unloading supers on him when you start to gain an excess. You're going to want to stay at 5 cards for most of the fight. Trust me. You will be able to get some whetstones in between these attacks. Jumping from a high cloud and holding left after whetstoning is usually safe. Make sure that you know when Pseudo Phase 2 happens, because Mr. Dragon's hurtbox shifts drastically and can trip you up if you're not prepared. A good strategy for Pseudo Phase 2 is to stay nearer the head as much as possible. It's very easy to tell when fireballs are coming out, and you can avoid the upwards ones with a well-timed whetstone. This of course can fail bad with bad cloud RNG. You know the phases transition when the tail shows up. The third pseudo phase is a combination of the last two strategy-wise. You want to position yourself in ways that the tail is in convenient locations when you're going to whetstone. When you're shooting this eye laser, it's usually hard to react to the second one, so don't preemptively unload cards on him when that happens. During the fireballs, it is good practice to just always assume that the fireball will go up, as that is the worst case scenario usually. It may take a bit of practice, but these phases eventually become consistent, in spite of the rampant randomness of it all. And that's going to be a common theme, because all these phases need to be consistent because of what comes next. Back a couple months ago, when I first arrived at the Fire Guys walking on the tongue phase, I had to sit there for a while and think, is this even possible? It actually is, but it's just very, very stupid. Because the dragon consistently shoots a tall wall of fire and smoke out of his nose, you have to wait just for the right moment for a high cloud to move over to the left side of the screen. You then have to jump over the fire smoke, whetstone, and then land on that same cloud just so you won't take damage. You then have to jump and dash over the fire smoke again to repeat this process. This is the only safe way to deal damage in this phase. Now, this would already be pretty annoying in a vacuum, but there are also those cheeky fire guys that will randomly jump at you. Sometimes you could be waiting for a nice tall cloud to come over and a fire boy will jump just at the right time to close that already infrequent window for you. You're somewhat able to bait the fire guys by waiting on a low platform, but this is also really inconsistent. This phase is just a combination of practice, patience, and prayer. This also just so happens to accurately describe the final phase tenfold. After what can be literally over 8 minutes of near perfect execution, you then have to face the Hydra. Remember a couple of seconds ago when I complained that the last phase had barely any openings for attacks? This is much worse. The Hydra's hurtbox is so small and much closer to the back of the heads than you would expect. The hitbox is much larger than that, and it is also drastically shifting, similar to a certain other boss from a previous aisle. This means you have to do something similar to the last phase, get on a high cloud, jump, whetstone, and then dash away. The heads, though, randomly shoot fireballs at you, so you're never really safe until the middle head goes into flamethrower mode. That is, if there are high enough clouds when he does it. And even if the stars align here, you have to jump from a very high cloud because of how far back the hurtbox of the Hydra is. Combined with the very long bouts of dodging random projectiles within a randomly generated space between opportunities, and it feels like you have to run a marathon just to get through this phase. The 5 cards that are saved through this phase only help so much, and playing through the earlier phases damageless can only help so much. Achieving both of these is a challenge on its own, only to be immediately rendered useless by this phase. Dealing with the Hydra has to be one of the most frustrating times playing any video game in my entire life. But I eventually beat him. So yeah, that's all for Inkwell Isle 2. Going back to the Pool of Death, we realized that we died 861 times, which is way more than 269 before this island. Honestly, after the dragon fight, Inkwell Isle 3 is scaring me very much. There are definitely some bosses on that island that will fare difficult in the whetstoning department. But I guess we'll have to wait and see in however many months it takes for this next video to come out. Anyway, that's it, goodbye.